I'm Haley from Gallifrey Public Radio, a Doctor Who fandom podcast and part of the GonnaGeek network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to episode 183 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we zero in on our episodes.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we talk about another announcement that is completely irrelevant to this Canadian.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we ask if you are taking a break.
Lauren, start the show now because SP and I need a break. We were on a break.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen Jondrew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 183 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen Jondrew, and I am pleased to say that I have a brand new co-host this week. That's right. It's SP again.
SP again. Okay, well, I'll take that. It's just I'm happy to be podcasting tonight because it's just been one of those weeks that you don't know if you're going to get to podcast and you really want to podcast. So I'm just happy to be here, Stephen, and thank you for coming tonight. By the way, listener, we start off every show with a How I Saved My Podcast story. That is stories from you, our listener, on how you literally saved your podcast. We try to coalesce all these stories and combine them and give them out to our entire listener base so we can all learn from our mistakes. And Stephen and I have had a bunch of our own stories, so everybody makes mistakes podcasting, including us. But today, we don't have a How I Saved My Podcast story. We have a How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. This is from Reddit. I saw this a few days ago, and I'm like, oh, we got to talk about this on How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. So this was a post by /hey, sorry, it's me, said, hi, I'm very new to this, so I apologize for being very uninformed. I'm looking to start a project about, quote, funny history, unquote. You could say, and I'm looking between the options, and it seems that it has come down to podcasting or YouTube. In your professional opinions, which one would be the most effective and what kind of audience would either draw? Thanks. Wow, Stephen, this is a loaded question. So first of all, I don't think you have to choose between podcasting and YouTube, right? So Jondrew Scott, who's been on this show before, right, Stephen?
Yes, he has. That was a long time ago. When was that?
You can look up the episode number. I'm going to keep on going with this example. So Jondrew Scott has a YouTube channel. It's called Podcastage. He also has a podcast called Jondrew Says. He uses the podcast as both a separate YouTube channel and a podcast itself. And that is an example of doing both. So you can do both. They are two slightly different things. I mean, if you wanted to go down the full YouTube route, you probably should do more video heavy centric issues. And if you wanted to go podcasting, you could go more audio centric, but you can happily do what Jondrew and we do and do a combination of the two and kind of do radio broadcasting with nice microphones and good sound quality, as well as pretty decent cameras, and do both as well. Or you could choose one or the other. I would say that the distribution is different between the two, because with YouTube, you're literally putting it on one distribution hub with YouTube. But with a podcast, that RSS feed goes wherever you actually submit it to. So between the two, I think that you get more bang for your buck from podcasting, but that's just me.
Before I comment number one, I'll go ahead and say that I dug out the episode. It was episode 64 of Better Podcasting nearly 2.5 years ago, January of 2017. Crazy. Episode 64, which can be found at betterpodcasting.com/64. 64 was when we had the wonderful Jondrew Scott on there, which was a lot of fun. And we'll have to have him back on here sometime. Number 2, I agree with everything that you said. I think that the only thing that I wanted to comment on was it's a really weird thing to come and ask this question in a podcasting subreddit. It seems like you're kind of biasing the response a little bit. I think that's an odd choice. I think something more neutral, like, is there a media, a content creator subreddit? I don't know. It's kind of like walking over to us and saying, what do you think about making money on your podcast? Well, we're geared towards a hobby podcaster, and we say we don't talk about money. Our answer is probably a little bit biased.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. So, but besides that, and I did check, and there is no other post from the user on any other subreddit. So he just, or she just went to the podcast subreddit, and that was it. Anyway, so that's my take on it. And if you have a true how you saved your podcast story, why don't you go ahead and get it into us? You can email us, podcast@betterpodcasting.com. You can contact us on our Discord server, betterpodcasting.com/Discord, or you can probably hit up us on Twitter to maybe pass the file in a DM @BetterPod.
Or you know what you could do? Go listen to episode 64 of Better Podcasting when we had Jondrew on there, get all of his contact information, send him an email saying, hey, can you pass this along to Steven and SP? That's what you should probably do.
That's a great idea.
Speaking of episodes from the past, during last week's episode, we mentioned that for milestone episodes, we like to go back to the basics here on this very Better Podcasting program. Well, as everybody in the world knows, one of your biggest milestone episodes that you'll ever have on your podcast is episode 183. It's hard to beat that. That is like the milestone of all of podcasting, which is why we made sure we went back to basics on episode 183, because it's obviously a milestone episode, right?
Milestone 183.
Right. So that's right. We're going all the way back for this week's episode, all the way back to before episode 1. Yes, that's right. We want to hit up episode 0 and talk a little bit about this before next week we kind of wrap up a little bit of this arc that we're going to have, where we talk about episode 1 and some of the differences between episode 0 and 1. So yes, today we're going to talk all about the concept of an episode 0, what it is, how you can use it, some things you might want to include, some things you might change, and just get to know episode 0. So let's go ahead and kick off this arc with this discussion today.
Now, Stephen, our listener might be wondering, what exactly is an episode 0? Essentially, we'll just call it an introduction to your podcast. And while a lot of people use this as a tease to the show when they're launching it, ultimately it's something that can be referenced for listeners who want to hear a snapshot of your show. We know what you're saying, but for many shows, when somebody subscribed, they're going to be downloading the latest episode of the show. Why would I bother doing an episode 0 that will be buried underneath many, many episodes? That's what you're saying. Well, first, let's start with the thing we just mentioned. New shows. Episode 0s could be a great way to tease your show or advertise your show and build the hype before you launch. And a lot of people want to be able to get in their feeds in different directories and get things established. And by starting with an episode 0, you can get all the kinks worked out and you can get everything set up before you make the big push to start building your actual show. For example, for Better Podcasting, we did an episode 0 with an announcement date a month, but not actually a day, attached to it. It was October 2015, if I remember correctly. What was great about this was we were able to make sure we had all of our technical I's dotted and T's crossed before we did the episode 1. Also, it was the first time that Stephen and I collaborated together solely on a show. So we used episode 0 to try some integration with the GonnaGeek site, figure out who would be managing what, and etc. of all the things behind the show. And we really used the episode 0 as a field test for the bridge between different services. So the episode 0 actually ironed out a lot of stuff for us. It was like we were starting podcasting again, especially since we were integrating the video option into the show from the beginning.
Now, episode zeros can actually be a really great assistance tool in submitting your RSS feeds to different directories, because most, if not all, directories are going to require you to have at least one episode in your feed in order to submit it to them. If you have this episode 0 in there, it's almost a placeholder so that you've got one episode in there before you kick off your show. This will allow you to go ahead and get that into all of those different directories that you want. It also allows you to look at the technical side of things with the submission and your field. For example, is everything set up properly, like your artwork or all of the descriptors? There's tons of different tags in an RSS feed, some of which are from the past, some of which are maybe being retired, but they're there. And if you have them filled out incorrectly, it can make things not look properly in some of these directories. So again, you get your episode 0 in your feed, and as you go through and you get all of that submitted to the different directories, especially Apple Podcasts, you can go ahead and see how that ends up stacking up. And when you think about things from a Google Podcast perspective, Google really has started to take the concept of we will find you. And so if you can get that feed out there sooner than later with that episode 0, there's a higher chance they'll actually find you versus not having a feed, because it's really hard to find something that's not existent.
Right. You want to have your show indexed in there. Also, one other thing that you could iron out would be the ID3 tags. If you've never podcasted before, you probably never really heard of an RSS or an ID3 or actually what goes on behind them. So in episode 0, we give you a chance to at least look at them and try different things in order to get them right for your real episode number 1. But episode 0s are not just for new podcasts. It's also important to consider that there are a variety of different types of podcasts and podcasters out there. There are different hosting styles and podcast feels, and we've talked about all of this before. And episode 0 is not only a great opportunity for you to talk about the concept of your show, but also demonstrate what the overall feeling of your show is. And you can use this episode later in the years as a quick demo or pitch, or maybe even a trailer. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
So, speaking of episode 0s, what exactly should we put in episode 0? It's probably a good thing to have if we're going to talk about episode 0s. Well, definitely you want to have your show's concept explained during this episode 0. So explain what your show's going to be about. What's the plan going to be for the show? Essentially, what is sort of the roadmap for your overall show? Also, try to highlight what makes you different, because it's very, very rare that there's a podcast concept that has no other, quote, competition. There's usually other people who are covering that. So talk a little bit about what makes you different. Now, one thing that some people forget to put into episode 0, especially if you're starting out and you're kind of using this as a bit of a tease, a bit of a snapshot of what you're going to be coming out with, is contact methods. It's good to have at least one contact method in your episode 0, so that if somebody ends up hearing it and they want to know a little bit more or interact with you, or maybe have a suggestion for you, right from the beginning, you're giving them that contact information. But be straightforward with this. Don't list everything under the sun, because that's a really quick way to lose somebody, is if you list a whole bunch of things. So maybe just keep to the main couple of contact methods. And this kind of segues perfectly into the overall recommendation we have for your episode 0, which is trying to keep it short and sweet while talking about the concept of your show and the various other elements of your show, because really you could potentially lose somebody. It's almost an information episode, and if it's too long-winded, you'll probably lose somebody. The other thing we think you should have in there is what, SB?
Personality. Now, we briefly mentioned this, but we do want to highlight you should be personable in your episode 0. Nobody wants to listen to a walking dictionary, so be authentic to your true personality and show it, display it in your voice. If you happen to be recording a video version, make sure you show it on the video too, but definitely in your voice. But you should also make the decision, do you want to do a personal introduction or do you want to save this for episode 1? Again, episode 0 is not an episode 1, so it's okay to save this personal introduction for an episode 1. It really depends on what you plan to do with episode 1. We'll talk about that next week. But it's important to remember sometimes episode 0 will be re-recorded eventually, and we'll get to that in a bit. But if this is the case and you've had some big notable episodes, they might be worth mentioning in the episode 0 as a teaser for future episodes for somebody just checking out your show for the first time.
And just to highlight again what he said, we're not looking for you to get that time travel machine. We're saying that there are circumstances where you might re-record it, and that might be something you would include if you are re-recording. We'll get to that in a minute. What shouldn't be included in there, which might help you shape a little bit about what makes a good episode 0? Well, number 1, don't put core content in there. You know how you said, this is what I'm going to talk about in my podcast? Don't talk about that. You want to talk about what you're going to talk about, but don't give that actual core content in episode 0. It's an introduction. Because a lot of people are going to see episode 0, and if they're familiar with episode 0s, they might even just gloss over that if they are coming to you late in the game, and you really don't want to bury something in episode 0 that you want people to check out. It's better to put that into episode 1. Also, avoid being too lengthy. It's really important that you do consider what we said, episode 0 is sort of a snapshot. And if you make it ramble on for too long, you might lose somebody, and it might actually have the opposite effect and drive somebody away from subscribing. Our episode 0 could probably be refreshed right now if we wanted to, but the way that we did our episode 0 actually was an introduction that we featured as a segment on the GonnaGeek.com show that SP and I were doing with Chris Farrell at the time, and actually someone named JS, and we did this as a bit of a segment one week on the GonnaGeek.com show, so we had it short enough that it fit onto an existing show, but also made an independent episode 0. So that's sort of what we did for ours. Another thing that you might want to avoid is making sure not to promise something that you can't guarantee will happen. A lot of new podcasters have really high ambitions. So maybe you go and you make that episode 0 and you're like, I'm going to go and do this daily podcast. And then they start doing the daily podcast and they realize how time consuming it is. So it's really important that if you are going to say something on your episode 0 as a tease of what you're going to cover, especially if you're using it during a brand new podcast, that you're able to fulfill that. Otherwise, you're just going to come off as not doing what you said you would do.
You need to look at what you want to do for your podcast in terms of explicit content. Now, even if your podcast is going to be explicit, it's probably a good idea to avoid this in your episode 0. This allows you to use the episode 0 in more places as a marketing tool in other places that might be non-explicit. You should state that you'll be explicit somehow so people aren't thrown off in the episode 0, but it's a good idea to skip profanity when you're actually recording episode 0. Another thing you want to avoid in your episode 0 is sponsorship information if you can. Now, we don't talk about money often on Better Podcasting, but we do want to say it's a good idea to avoid it in episode 0 unless your podcast is completely sponsored by somebody. If you're going to be selling space on your show eventually, that sponsor can change through the course of the show. And episode 0 is a sort of a preview to your show, so it's a good idea to keep it more flexible by not using the sponsorship in episode 0.
We also have some technical considerations that you might have with your episode 0. And this is one that SP loves talking about because it's all about Apple Podcasts and essentially Apple Podcast tags.
Yeah, remember in WWDC 2017, Apple Podcasts came out for some specific episode RSS tags that nobody else really uses, but one of the tags per episode that is involved in the RSS feed now is a trailer. So you can actually tag the episode as a trailer in an Apple Podcast, and anybody else that uses any other directory or player that uses the Apple Podcast episode tags, they can throw it as a trailer in the feed as well. And are you producing the episode 0 with an intro and outro? It's actually okay not to. It's not your episode number 1. So you can make it a little bit more informal, a little bit different. I would encourage you to do so, actually. And that makes it stand out as not a regular episode. Especially if you're working out the fine details of things like the intros and the extras or outros and the different things that you use for bumps and segments along the way. An episode 0 might not have that in its full form yet. Like you're really excited to be recording and you just don't know all of the processes involved in your production process. And I think that by skipping that in an episode 0, you could be ahead of the game. And then eventually, if you want to re-record it years down the road, it doesn't really matter what version of the intro or outro you have. You're just going in blind.
One thing that I want to mention as well before we sort of wrap this up here is what SP just said, which is that it's getting you behind the microphone. And that is a big benefit to episode 0 because it's going to allow you to practice your setup, get things together, especially if you're starting out new totally. But in any case, sort of find that feel for that specific show. We've mentioned it before that when you start a new show, it feels different. It does take you a little bit of time to get comfortable, no matter how many podcasts you've done. And so episode 0 is a good opportunity for you to get behind that mic for that specific show.
Finally, we talked about this several times in the episode already. We're going to address it right now. Consider that an episode 0 may eventually need to be swapped out. Yes, sometimes you may want to revisit the information in your episode 0. Why would you want to do that? Maybe the concept of your show has actually changed along the way. Maybe your hosts have changed. Perhaps your format has changed. You said you were 30 minutes, now you're 60 minutes. You said you were weekly, now you're bi-weekly, etc. Ultimately, an episode 0 is a gateway to your show, so it's important to make sure the episode 0 reflects the entirety of your show. The gateway could be taken as a sales pitch, and if you don't want to pull a bait and switch accidentally, you might want to tell the listener what they're in for in the actual show as it goes on. Now, Stephen, we talked about this before the show. I've actually replaced or put in an episode 0 for 2 of my feeds for Starling Tribune and Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. Those shows did not have an episode 0 to start off with. Matter of fact, Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. started off with completely different hosts in the first 13 episodes. And then we changed hosts along the way, but Haley and I have been with the show since episode 14. So what we wanted to do in our episode 0 is we wanted to use it as a trailer. It's actually 30 seconds long, so it could be used as a 30-second trailer. And it's with our new host and definitely featuring Lauren. So that was something that we put in place after the fact. And if you're not familiar with RSS feeds, you can actually post-date a episode in your feed and it will show up first. So that's one way to do it. And second of all, if you actually put it as a tag, as a trailer episode, it will show up as a trailer like we talked about in Apple Podcasts or anybody else that uses it. Now for Starling Tribune, that was simply, we wanted to put together a trailer for the show. So we put it in afterwards. I predated it and I'll have to check. I don't think I've actually taken that as a trailer, but I could tag that as a trailer. I don't do seasons for either the show. That's another tag that Apple Podcasts put in per episode. And I don't do that. It's just one continuous feed for both shows. So I'm not sure I'd want to do that with a trailer or not. I might actually experiment with that a little bit and come back if anybody would like to know about that. Stephen, I'm curious where we're going next week.
Well, next week, we're going to talk a little bit about episode 1 and some of the elements that you want to have in your episode 1 that are kind of related to what we talked about in episode 0. As well, we'll touch a little bit about if you're not going to have an episode 0, because that's the reality. You might not actually do the episode 0. So we look forward to talking a little bit about this whole concept a bit more next week. It's been a while since we've done an arc on better podcasting, and you new listeners might not be familiar. We used to do a lot of them, and I'm excited to do another one and talk about it next week.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting download.
So we were thinking about what to talk about in the Better Podcasting Download this week, and we know that Libsyn made a recent announcement of establishing a new publishing destination of radio.com. And to be honest, since the announcement, I've been a little bit busy and I haven't been able to check it out. But I generally know that when Libsyn brings on a new destination, they're often in the lead, they beta test, or they're one of the first ones out of the gate to do it because they understand that publishing your feed to multiple destinations is a good way to distribute it to a listener in any format that they want to listen to the podcast. So I agree with that. Now, there's some concerns that have been had along the way. We'll take Luminary for an example, that some people didn't want their content on Luminary. That was just a few months ago. We already said our opinions on that. And in case you didn't hear, my opinion is I want my shows distributed everywhere. But if you have IP controlled content you want to make sure you retain ownership of, I can completely understand wanting to do that. Luminary has changed their practices, so I think it's fine to distribute them even if you do have IP controlled content now. But with radio.com, I just take that as an additional destination. I'm going to look into it this next week, and next week I'll come back and talk about how I've submitted my shows to it on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Starling Tribune, and let you know what I found and if there's anything to do about that. And Stephen, I know you have certain concerns about radio.com.
Well, here's the thing. Number one, I want to start off by saying I did see when this was happening because I think it was the day before there was a tease that there would be an announcement made exclusively through the Libsyn app. I think that Libsyn has been doing this last couple of announcements. They've been driving people to get the app, to get the latest information. There's all sorts of benefits to getting people to download your app. So that's what they're doing, I guess. And Facebook, though, on the Libsyn Facebook, when this was announced, there was a quote from Rob Walsh that said, "The radio.com partnership will make it easier for listeners to consume our great podcast by making the podcast directly available on an app they already use." So obviously that's in reference to people who are using the radio.com app. Now, I was in the same boat as SP when this all came out because I was following this pretty closely. What's radio.com? I hadn't heard of radio.com. And to be honest, I was surprised that it was in existence because I've had lots of people, especially in the podcast industry, tell me that radio is dead. So I was like, oh, radio.com, it's in existence. Cool, it's alive. So I went and I took a look at it and I'm like, all right, let's have a look. And I pull up the website and I'm like, number one, I don't personally care for the website, but that's okay. We'll move on through there. Let's click on a feed and have a look and play a stream from a radio station here. And it didn't work. Okay. So I'll go and I'll download the app. So I pull up the Google Play Store. I type in radio.com. I don't see it anywhere. To which I look a little bit further on the website and see this quote that is in the about section of radio.com. Is radio.com available in my country? The answer to the question is, quote, radio.com is currently unavailable outside of the United States, end quote. That's why I hadn't heard of radio.com, because it's not in my country. So yes, it's not something that's going to work into my workflow or honestly most people outside of the US, because it's again another exclusive US service, kind of like Pandora was. But obviously there's a partnership there, which means that there's probably a certain market that radio.com has that Libsyn is wanting to embrace. So if this is something that you use, I think it's really just helpful to keep only one app. It's nice to have one app and one thing, which, come to think of it, is a little bit contradictory to the idea of making the announcement exclusively through an app that I can't get through my podcast player, but that's beside the point. I just thought of that now. But it is helpful for a day-to-day sort of basis where people might be listening to radio.com or listening to things through there, and it keeps them in that same app if they're comfortable with it. So that's cool. If you don't host on Libsyn, I did notice while I was looking to see if they were in my area, I came across this link, which is a podcast submission form. They do have a manual submission form. I might go ahead and submit something just to see how it goes, because I don't know how fast it's going to be. But if you want to go to geeks.link/radio submit, that'll forward you over to the radio.com submission. There is 10 different things in there, a couple of which are just acknowledgement agreements. So there's not a lot, but I will say that they do ask your estimated average downloads per episode. So I don't know if that's something that Libsyn's releasing, or it's just one of those things that, because there's lots of really good partnerships that Libsyn's had, their standing up is enough. I'm not sure. But yeah, if you are going to submit at radio.com, you do have to put in the average downloads per episode. And the last thing that I want to mention on this is, I know when I was trying to play the stream a couple times on radio.com, I heard ads before the stream didn't play. So they were willing to serve me the ad just fine, one of which was in another language, but they were willing to serve me the ad. I quickly clicked to another podcast and I didn't hear an ad on the podcast. So I don't think they're monetizing directly that podcast. I can't speak either way, because honestly, once I saw it wasn't in my region, I didn't do a lot more research. But I did notice that there was ads on the radio streams, but I didn't see it on the one that I clicked on the podcast side of thing, which is probably a good thing.
Was one of the languages that you heard that you didn't understand English? Because I know you speak Canadian.
That's true. That's absolutely true. That's probably why. There was no
Okay.
A or poutine talk in it.
So I want to pull up to the 50,000 foot level here and take a strategic view of this based on some things that we say and some things that we know. So most podcasts have been historically downloaded in the United States. So I could see trying to capitalize on that. However, recently we've had dedicated surveys in Canada and in Australia, and I believe the UK too. I might be wrong about that, but there is this growing trend of podcast listenership across the world, not just in the United States, especially as smartphones become available in more places. And quite honestly, as more people actually learn about podcasting, I don't think podcasts are for everyone. I don't think we've ever actually said that on this show, but there is a certain sector of the population that loves podcasts. And I think if you make the podcast available to people, how they consume it in their country of origin, we might be seeing more of this. We might be seeing more of the Pandora and the radio.coms in other markets. Like, I'm pretty sure, and Stephen, you'll have to back me up on this, there are distribution content providers or destinations in Canada that are not available in the United States. I can't get to them there, or in Australia or in UK. So I know we've seen some distribution destinations in the United States specifically, but we haven't really seen a lot in other countries that are exclusive to those countries. So I think we might be seeing more of that as this becomes more of a lucrative business model. But I say that this is where the RSS 2.0 feed really shines, is that if you continue to produce your podcast to an RSS 2.0 feed, you will be worldwide available on whatever platform that is, at least for now, until that changes. And that's what makes your hobby podcast available worldwide. And you should keep on doing that. So while radio.com might not be in Canada right now, and I'm sorry about that, is just another issue that you have to deal with of being in another country, I do see some value in this because, as you stated, there's got to be some actual listeners on radio.com. Otherwise, why would Libsyn want to do it? Or projected listenership. Otherwise, why would Libsyn want to partner? So I think it's all a good thing.
Well, how about you pour yourself a cup of Tim Hortons, grab yourself a poutine, say your ABCs and your XYZs, as we blow the roof off of the Better Pod back, eh? There's the Canadianisms for all of you who like the Canadianisms. Well,
I'm sure there's more.
There's probably a lot more.
You didn't mention maple syrup, right?
That's true. That's true. Let's talk about some things that were said in our Discord this week. That's right. If you didn't know this, we actually have a Discord channel, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com/Discord. We've had a lot of people coming in there lately, and we'd love to keep the chatter up because we think there's a lot of value that everybody has to offer to each other. And we're just building a community over there. And we had somebody actually come and say that they're listening to their first Better Podcasting episode, didn't they, SP?
Ian the Beard. So I'm kind of both surprised and intrigued and horrified that we actually have a beard named Ian in our Discord server. But anyway, Ian the Beard said, listening to my first BP episode number 179. I can already tell this is gonna be one of my favorites. Thanks, Ian.
Episode 179 was the little but easily forgotten about things of podcasting. This is where we talked a little bit about a bunch of these things that people take for granted that they do every single day that they podcast. And so we talked about that. It was also the one where Stargate Pioneer was indeed in a hotel room. So it was in a hotel room, which might be why he liked it, because he found you more relatable being on a couple of easily recommended microphones like the Samson Q2U and the Audio-Technica AT2005. That's probably why.
Yeah, maybe I should just do that every episode. Just for better podcasting, though.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Oh, okay.
Next up, we had Waffles say, what are your podcast superstitions? I don't ever say on Twitter or otherwise out in public when I'm recording because something always goes wrong and it doesn't happen. I've tried to give people a heads up when I've had a big guest in case they wanted to send in questions, and then we end up not being able to record. I mention how I'm going to record a milestone episode, then the internet seems to go out. Without fail, if I say I'm recording tonight, there's a 100% chance that something will happen and I won't be recording that night. I love this. I love this comment here. We didn't actually have a lot of people back and forth, but I thought it was worthy of mentioning on the show because there's probably a lot of people just nodding right now as I read through that.
Yep, me too. That's for sure. We had a reply from some music guy in Phoenix. And he said at Waffles, which is how you introduce yourself on Discord. With regards to your superstition, I was interviewed about 10 days back for another podcast, and that had host just tweeted about the quote, to be released this Sunday, unquote episode. And I thought of you and your post this morning.
Well, let's have you tell us or get in our Discord chat and tell Waffles. We don't care. What is your podcasting superstitions? For me personally, whenever I get ready to record this show, I have to make sure to do a specific routine, and that routine involves praying to a picture of Stargate Pioneer that's on my desk. I just go ahead and say that right now.
I'm not a god, man. Don't treat me like a god. Don't ever do that. If you're a listener, don't know. I'm just a dude, and that's I would actually prefer to pray to somebody else. So anyway, Waffles came back and later in the Discord and he said, this looks interesting. Got an email from Waves talking about their new Flex plan, which has you pay for 2 years and get 5, 10, or 20 plugins. And for right now, get 1 or 2, 1, 3, or 4 plugins for free, depending on what plan you want to go with. The cheapest is $240 for 5 plugins plus the free one. And as you go with a bigger plan, you may get more plugins to pick from. I'm assuming that they're going for the people who will impulse buy here. From my quick look at prices, you could easily get your money's worth on the cheapest plan, and I'd hope on the others as well. I was looking at the current sale price and not their suggested high price.
So really, I think what this is here is this is an opportunity to offer people an option who can't afford to buy things outright. I think that it's easy for people to do math and go, you know what, there's a lot of good Waves plugin sales and it doesn't really make a lot of sense because they're going to pay so much more over the course of a couple of years than they would if they just paid the money up front. A lot of phone carriers, at least up here right now, are doing deals where if you bring your own phone, you get a deal on your monthly plan. And if you do the quick math, you quickly realize that that's a far better deal than going and paying a reduced price on a piece of hardware, but paying more per month. But people do that because they can't afford to buy the phone outright up front. It's the same idea here. Some Waves plugins can be really expensive. I generally recommend not buying Waves plugins not on sale because there is a lot of sales. But some of these packages are things that people can't afford to pay outright. And so here you're almost offering a subscription type model. I've talked about this before with XSplit. one of the reasons why I went with XSplit versus what I wanted to go with, which XSplit, by the way, is the video changing software, production software that I use for the show. The reason I went with that versus what I wanted to, which was vMix, was because vMix, I had to go and buy outright, which was way too expensive for me. With XSplit, they had a subscription model for me so that I could afford to pay a little bit at a time. I think I found a good balance with paying for like at 6 months, or maybe it was 3 months at a time to start, where I got a bit of a price break. But ultimately, that subscription model ended up allowing me to afford something that I couldn't afford without it. So I think that's what this whole thing is for those people who just can only afford that $10 a month. That's all they can afford. And they want it now, and they can't wait to put that $10 a month aside so that in a year from now, they can go and get the better deal. It's just another option, I think, for buying these plugins.
There is another consideration. Most of the plugins that I've seen lately, they've all been redone at some point in time. And then you go with the newer option, and it has more bells and whistles and generally works better. So if you're going to be buying a plugin and then know that you're going to have to buy it again to get the better quality in a couple of years anyway, the subscription model kind of works for you in your advantage, because then you don't have to continue to buy this huge package every couple of years to get this vast quantity. You're a hobby podcaster. You don't have the throughput of a big studio, of a professional studio, and they have the overhead that they can actually buy those plugins for the production. And they also have revenue coming in, which if you're a hobby podcaster, you might not want that or might not have that. So the issue here of being able to afford it versus not being able to afford it, that could make the quality of your podcast a little bit better. You're going to have to do some evaluation on whether or not that's worth it to you, and whether or not that makes your podcast better to listen to, or maybe you're just being a little bit more proud of your production in the end by using plugins. And I use plugins. Steven used plugins. They are great. They are amazing. They do a lot of work. I'll tell you, I was taking out some mouth clicks and ticks and stuff like that in my Audacity days of when I was editing on Audacity. It took a long time to do that manually. Yes, you can go in, you can repair the individual ticks or delete that little tick in there sometimes. Takes hours for 1 hour podcast. It was like 20 hours of editing time. And by buying a $20 plugin pack, I was able to take that 20 hours and reduce it down to 6. I mean, and that was just one plugin. And then I added another and another and another. And I was able to get the production process a lot faster. Now, if you're somebody that just likes to grind and you like to edit manually, good on you. Some people like doing that. They consider it a video game. But if you're just trying to get the best product out there with minimal time to put in it, plugins are great. And then this concept here of the affordability, I think it's something that every hobby podcaster should consider.
I think that you also hit a really good point with your service comment, because Waves does generally do a service agreement. In fact, not agreement, but if you want to get the latest version, you do have to go ahead at some point and pay for a essentially a service upgrade sort of thing. And I actually did that myself. I think I only own like 3 Waves plugins, and I wanted to get to the current version of the platform that they run on, and it cost me $27 US for those 3 plugins to be able to upgrade to the newest version. So it's just an example, and I think that you definitely nailed it there. We also tweeted something about a week or so ago, which was this weekend in the United States is a long weekend and the unofficial start of the summer. Will you be taking the weekend off from podcasting, or will you be taking care of podcast business? For those non-Americans, do you have any special podcast plans for the weekend? And we got a few responses, and we wanted to highlight a couple of them. First was from our wonderful friend, we'll call him friend, fan of the show, Diami Polaki. And Diami said what?
We'll be posting as usual, but are in the middle of a 2-month recording break as a result of a backlog of live episodes recorded back to back at conferences. Ooh, Diami went to conferences. I wonder if they were in Tijuana.
I wonder, were they? There's a callback for people who've been listening a long time and cared to actually remember a terrible joke that we made, which shame on you, because don't remember our jokes. We like to reuse them later. We also had at Right Reasons Pod say the Bachelorette goes in the summer, so we will go in the summer, and we're only 5 episodes in, so we couldn't afford to stop. You know what? Definitely model your podcast off of the Bachelorette. How can you go wrong? It's the Bachelorette, SP. You're a fan of the Bachelorette.
I am not, but I will admit that when the Bachelorette reunion, 2-hour reunion show came on a few weeks ago before they started their season, I was told to make sure I recorded on every single DVR in the house. So yes, the Bachelorette reunion special was on our DVRs until I made sure that they were watched, not by me, and then I went around deleting them.
Likely story. It's okay. You're with friends here. If you like the Bachelorette, you like the Bachelorette, SP. If you model your podcast after the Bachelorette, we want you to get in touch with us through any of the ways. You can go ahead and find us at BetterPod on Twitter. You can go ahead and go to facebook.com/betterpodcasting or head to discord.com/betterpodcasting. And my favorite current way that you can contact us is by getting in touch with Stargate Pioneer on his brand new podcast that he's got, SP Talks Bachelorette.
That will never happen, Stephen. No, do not find me on a Bachelorette podcast. Nope. Although I will state this. If somebody wants to pay me, let's see, what's $10 million? It's 8 digits, right? If somebody wants to pay me 8 digits, I'll do it.
I almost had my wife convinced to do a Bachelorette podcast a while. I don't watch it, but I almost had her convinced to do a podcast a while back, but then life did not deal us the right cards. So that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for this show. Before we close, we want to mention to you, we are part of the GonnaGeek Network. The GonnaGeek Network has a bunch of amazing geeky content on there. Please head on over to GonnaGeek.com. So for episode number 183, a milestone episode of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen Jondrew saying you just don't hit milestones like 183 anymore.
And I'm SP saying, I hope you have a good week. Look forward to talking with you next week about episode 1. See you guys. Bye.
Toodles.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a GonnaGeek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.